In Massachusetts, Samuel was part of a world built by ordinary people, farmers, families, tradesmen, neighbors, people who worked hard, worshipped, argued, gathered, planted, repaired, and endured. It was not a perfect world, but it was their world. And by 1775, many believed that world was being threatened.
I have lived long enough to know what power looks like. I have seen men follow orders. I have seen flags carried into battle. But I have also lived long enough to know this. A home is not only a house. It is the people behind the door. It is the road your children walk. It is the future you hope your grandchildren might inherit.
On April 19, 1775, history began to move. Before sunrise, British regulars marched out from Boston. Their mission was to seize colonial military supplies believed to be stored in Concord. But the countryside was not asleep. Warnings had spread through the night. Riders carried the alarm from town to town. Church bells rang. Militia companies gathered. Men left their homes, their workshops, and their fields. By morning, the first shots had been fired at Lexington. Then came Concord, and by afternoon, the British column was marching back toward Boston. But the road back was no longer just a road. It had become a gauntlet. The British troops were exhausted. They had been marching for hours. They had expected resistance. But not like this. From behind trees, stone walls, barns, and fences, colonial militia fired along the road. This was not a battlefield in the old European sense. There were no neat lines facing each other across an open field. This was a road fight, a running fight, a fight that moved from town to town, stood directly in its path. It was not looking for fame. It was a village of homes, families, shops, farms, and meeting houses. But on that afternoon, its road became part of the first day of the American Revolution. The war was no longer a rumor, no longer a political argument, no longer a fear whispered behind closed doors. It was smoke in the trees. Footsteps on the road, gunfire in the distance. And for Samuel Whittemore, it was coming closer with every minute.
We heard the news before we saw the soldiers. Lexington conquered. Shots fired, men killed. The words moved faster than the army. And by the time the smoke reached us, every man in Menotomy knew the world had changed. I stood near the road and listened. At first, it was distant, a crack, then another, then many. Muskets do not sound like thunder. They sound sharper, closer, more personal. And each shot told us the army was coming nearer. I had lived through enough years to know when a moment is no longer asking for words. It is asking for a decision.
By the time the sound of gunfire reached Menotomy, Samuel Whittemore understood what was coming. The road that passed near his home was no longer just a road. It was the path of an army. British soldiers were retreating from Concord. Colonial militia were closing in from the countryside, and Menotomy stood between them. Samuel had lived long enough to know that fear is not weakness. Fear is what tells a man the moment is real, but courage is what tells him he still has a choice. Inside his home, or perhaps nearby, were the tools of two different lives, the tools of a farmer and the weapons of an old veteran. A hoe, a fence, a field, a musket, a pistol, a sword. One life had been built around planting, working, repairing, and providing. The other remembered smoke, marching, and war. On that afternoon, both lives met beside the road. Samuel armed himself. According to traditional accounts, he carried a musket, pistols, and a sword. Then he moved toward a stone wall near his home. He did not do this because he believed one old man could defeat an army. He did it because some moments do not ask whether we can do everything. They ask whether we will do what is ours to do. The British column was drawing closer. The smoke was thicker now. The sounds were sharper. Boots struck the road. Muskets cracked in the distance. And Samuel Whittemore, nearly 80 years old, took his place near the stone wall.
I knew I could not outrun them. I knew I could not stand against a column of soldiers for long. But I knew the road, I knew the wall, and I knew what was at stake. Behind me were homes. Behind me were families. Behind me was the life we had built. I had spent years working the land, planting, mending, raising children, watching grandchildren grow. And I had lived long enough to know that freedom is not kept by words alone. There comes a time when a man must decide whether the things he believes are only thoughts or whether they are worth standing for. So I took up what I had, an old musket, an old sword, and an old man's resolve.
The British column came closer. Men who had marched through the morning were now struggling through the afternoon. They were tired, angry, under pressure. Every wall, every tree, every bend in the road could hide another musket. The road back to Boston had become a place of fear for the army that had marched out before sunrise. And near that road, Samuel Whittemore waited. He was nearly 80 years old. He knew the strength of youth was gone from him. He knew the British soldiers were trained, armed, and moving in number. But he also knew the land. He knew the wall. He knew the distance between the road and his home. And when the redcoats came into view through the smoke, the old farmer made a stand. Traditional accounts say Samuel fired on the British soldiers as they passed through Menotomy. In the confusion of that violent afternoon, he is credited with killing or wounding several British regulars. But one old man could not remain hidden forever. The soldiers reached him. The distance closed. The road, the wall, the smoke, and the shouting all collapsed into one terrible moment. Samuel was shot. He was struck down. He was bayoneted. And the British soldiers, believing him dead, left him where he fell. By every expectation, Samuel Whittemore's story should have ended beside that road. A farmer, a father, a grandfather.
I saw them through the smoke, redcoats, bayonets, faces worn down by fear and anger. They were men as I was a man, but they were coming through my home, through my village, past the road my family knew. I did not think of victory. I did not think of whether my name would be remembered. I thought of the wall before me, the homes behind me, and the duty in my hands. So I raised the musket. I fired. For a moment, the world became smoke and noise. Then they saw me. I remember boots on the road, shouting, the flash of steel, the ground rising toward me, and then I was down. I could hear the war moving past, but I was still there, breathing, bleeding, holding to the earth beneath my hands.
An old veteran who had stood one last time. But history was not finished with him.
And somewhere inside me I thought, not yet.
Samuel Whittemore should have died beside that road. By the time the British soldiers moved on, the smoke still hung over Menotomy. The sounds of the fighting continued farther down the road. But near the stone wall, the old farmer still breathed. Local people found him there, wounded, broken, but alive. The man the British had left for dead had not let go. He was carried from the field, and somehow, against every expectation, Samuel Whittemore survived. His wounds were severe. His body had been battered by the violence of that afternoon. Most men would not have lived through what he endured. Most men half his age might not have lived through it. But Samuel recovered. The farmer of Menotomy lived for years after the day history came to his doorstep. And that is part of why his story endured. Not because he changed the course of the war by himself, not because one man stopped an army, but because Samuel Whittemore became a picture of something larger. He became a reminder that the American Revolution was not only fought by famous leaders, it was fought by ordinary people, farmers, fathers, grandfathers, neighbors, men and women whose names rarely stand at the center of the story, but whose courage helped carry the weight of it. On April 19, 1775, the road from Concord to Boston became a proving ground. It proved that the conflict had moved beyond arguments, petitions, and speeches. It had come to homes, to villages, to fields, to people who had to decide what they believed enough to stand for. Samuel Whittemore's stand at Menotomy was not the whole revolution, but it was one clear image of its beginning. An old man near a stone wall, a musket in his hands, a village behind him, an army before him, and a belief that the future was worth facing danger for. Today, Lexington and Concord are remembered as the beginning of the American Revolution. But Menotomy reminds us that history does not only happen in the places everyone names. Sometimes history happens on a village road, beside a fence, near a stone wall, in the life of a person who never planned to be remembered. Samuel Whittemore was a farmer, a father, a grandfather, a neighbor. And when history came down the road, he stood where he believed he was needed. That is why his story still matters. Because courage is not only found in the young, it is not only found in the powerful, it is not only found in the famous. Sometimes courage is found in an old man's hands, in a quiet decision, in a body that should have stayed down, but did not. History did not just happen at Menotomy. Someone lived it. And his name was Samuel Whittemore.
I do not remember everything. Some memories came as sounds, smoke moving through the trees, boots fading down the road, voices calling my name, hands lifting me from the earth. I remember pain. I remember breath. I remember wondering why I was still alive, but I was. The road had taken much from me that day, but it had not taken everything. I had stood where I believed I was needed. I had done what was mine to do. And if my story is remembered at all, let it not be because I was old and survived. Let it be because I believed that even an old man still had something to give. I was a farmer, a father, a grandfather, neighbor. And for one afternoon, when history came through Menotomy, I stood.